What have I done that has been never be done on this earth before? I will never come back again.
She swore she'd never come back. She'd cut them off completely. No calls, no birthdays, nothing for 11 years. Then one Tuesday morning, broken out of options, she stood on her parents' porch again. What she didn't know was that the truth waiting behind that door would break her more than leaving ever did. This is a true story of betrayal, pride, and the debt we never think we'll have to pay. Her name was Emily Carter, and for 11 years she had built a life 1,000 miles away from the small town where she grew up. To her old neighbors, to the people who once watched her ride a bike down Maple Street, she had simply vanished. No forwarding address, no explanation, just silence where a daughter used to be. But silence, as her family would eventually learn, is never really empty. It carries weight. It grows heavier every year it's allowed to sit, until one day it becomes too heavy for even the person who created it to keep carrying alone. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Emily Carter before she disappeared? What actually happened the night she walked out of her parents' house for the last time? And why, after 11 years of complete silence, did she choose that particular Tuesday to knock on a door she had promised herself she'd never touch again? To understand how her story ends, you first have to understand how it began, back when Emily Carter was still just a girl trying to make her parents proud. Emily grew up in a modest brick house on the edge of a small Ohio town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business whether they wanted to or not. Her father, Robert Carter, ran a small hardware store that had been in the family for 2 generations, a store his own father had built with his hands and handed to him with more pride than profit. Her mother, Margaret, worked as a school secretary and kept the household running with a kind of quiet discipline that Emily both admired and resented as a teenager. They were not wealthy people, but they were proud ones, the kind of family that paid its debts on time and never asked for help even when help was badly needed. Emily was the oldest of 2 children. Her younger brother, Daniel, was the easygoing one, content with a simple life close to home, never chasing anything much further than the county line. Emily was different from the time she was young, and everyone in the family seemed to sense it before she could put words to it herself. She was the kind of child who read the encyclopedia for fun, who asked her teachers questions they couldn't answer, who stood in the hardware store aisles as a girl imagining, out loud, a life that had nothing to do with paint cans or lumber. Robert used to laugh about it at dinner, telling relatives that his daughter was going to run the world someday, and there was real pride in his voice when he said it. Margaret would smile too, though there was something more careful underneath her smile, something that looked, in hindsight, a little like fear. By the time Emily reached high school, that early promise had turned into something more concrete. She was the first in her family to talk seriously about college, the first to fill out applications to schools 3 states away, the first to dream out loud about a life her parents had never lived themselves. She spent her junior year staying up past midnight studying for exams at the kitchen table, long after Robert and Margaret had gone to bed, driven by a hunger neither of her parents fully understood, but both, in their own ways, tried to support. Robert took on extra hours at the store to help cover an SAT prep course. Margaret drove her 2 hours each way to a scholarship interview, without complaint. They were proud of her ambition, but pride and fear often live in the same house, and beneath their support was a quiet, unspoken worry about what it would cost them to let her go, and more than that, what it would cost her. Family dinners in those years were warm but layered, filled with laughter on the surface and quiet tension underneath, the kind only a family can read in each other's silences. Daniel, 3 years younger, often sat quietly through these conversations, watching his sister describe cities he'd never heard of and majors he couldn't pronounce, feeling something between admiration and a small, private ache of being left behind before anyone had actually left. Nobody said it out loud, But everyone at that table could feel that Emily was already halfway out the door long before she ever packed a suitcase, and everyone, in their own way, had already begun grieving her absence before it happened. The cracks started small, the way they always do. A comment from Robert one evening about Emily spending too much time on her plans and not enough time helping out at the store on weekends. A comment Emily took far more personally than Robert had intended. A missed family gathering, her grandmother's 80th birthday. Because of a scholarship interview, she didn't want to reschedule, a choice that made practical sense to Emily and felt, to the rest of the family, like an early sign of where her priorities truly stood. An argument over a boyfriend her parents didn't approve of during her senior year. One Emily was convinced they simply didn't understand, and one that ended, predictably, within a few months, though the argument's damage lasted far longer than the relationship itself did. None of these moments were catastrophic on their own. Any one of them, taken by itself, would have been forgotten within a season. But together they formed a slow current pulling Emily further from home, even while her body still slept under her parents' roof every night. Daniel watched it all from the sidelines, caught between a sister he loved and parents he didn't want to see hurt, never fully realizing how much responsibility would eventually fall on his shoulders because of choices that weren't his to make. He would later describe those years, to his own wife, as the quiet before a storm nobody in the house wanted to admit was already forming on the horizon. Emily left for college on a partial scholarship, and for a few years, distance actually seemed to help. Phone calls home were frequent at first, full of updates about classes and new friends, and a version of independence that still felt tethered to the family she'd grown up in. She came home for holidays. She helped at the store during the busy season one last time, the summer after her sophomore year. And for a brief window, it looked like the cracks from high school might simply heal on their own with enough time and enough space. But underneath that surface calm, something else was happening. Emily was building a version of herself that existed entirely outside her family's frame of reference. A version with plans, connections, and a growing conviction that the life waiting for her back in Ohio was simply too small for who she was becoming. Nobody in that house knew it yet, but the conversation that was coming would be the last real conversation this family would have for over a decade. It happened the summer Emily turned 24. Robert's hardware store had been struggling for 2 years by then, quietly bleeding money in a town where a new chain store had opened just outside the county line, undercutting prices Robert couldn't match without losing money on every sale. Robert and Margaret had taken a second mortgage on the house to keep the doors open, believing, the way small business owners often do, that one good season could turn everything around, that loyalty from longtime customers would eventually outweigh a few dollars saved at the bigger store down the highway. It hadn't worked the way they'd hoped. By that summer, the store was months from closing, and Robert, never a man comfortable asking for help, had finally admitted as much to his wife late one night, a conversation Margaret only shared with Emily years later. Emily, who had recently come into a modest inheritance from her grandmother, had been asked to help. Not asked directly at first, but hinted at, the way families hint at things they're afraid to say plainly, small comments over the phone about how tight things were, about how nice it would be to have a little extra breathing room. Emily, for her part, had other plans for that money entirely, plans that involved leaving the state to chase a job opportunity she had been offered in a city none of them had ever visited together, a position at a growing marketing firm that felt, to her, like the first real door opening onto the life she'd been imagining since she was a girl standing in her father's store aisles. The argument that followed was the kind that had been building for years, finally given permission to explode. It started over dinner, Robert asking, more directly than he ever had before, whether Emily had thought about what the store's closing would mean for the family, whether she understood that Daniel would likely have to leave his own community college plans to help pick up the slack if the business folded entirely. Emily, caught off guard and immediately defensive, said she couldn't put her entire future on hold to prop up a business that had been failing for years before she'd even been asked to help. Robert accused her of choosing herself over her family, of taking the education and the opportunities they had sacrificed to give her and using them to walk away instead of giving back when it finally mattered. Emily accused her parents of trying to trap her in a life she never wanted, of confusing love with obligation, of expecting her to pay for choices that were never hers to begin with. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway during most of it, saying almost nothing, watching two people she loved tear at each other in a way she had never seen before and would never forget. She tried once to step between them, suggesting they all take a breath and talk about it in the morning. But neither Robert nor Emily was willing to stop mid-argument, both too deep into years of accumulated hurt to hear anything except their own side of it. Daniel, 21 at the time and home for the summer, stood frozen near the stairs, watching the two people he most wanted to protect say things to each other that he sensed, even in the moment, could not simply be taken back with an apology the next day. Words were said that night that none of them would ever fully take back. Words about loyalty, about selfishness, about who owed what to whom, about years of quiet resentment that had never once been spoken aloud until that single unbearable evening let all of it out at once. Robert told Emily she had always thought she was better than this family, better than this town, better than the store that had put food on her table for 18 years. Emily told her father that she refused to spend her entire life apologizing for wanting something different than what he had, that not every child owed their parents a life sentence of gratitude disguised as obligation. Neither of them, in the years that followed, ever fully remembered who said the very last thing that night, only that by the time it was said, something between them had broken in a way that felt, to both of them, irreversible. Emily left 3 days later. She used the inheritance money to fund her move, took the job across the country, and told herself, the way people often do when they're running from something, that she would call once things settled down, once the anger cooled, once enough time had passed for a real conversation to happen without either of them saying something they'd regret all over again. She had no way of knowing that the next time she stood in that kitchen, 11 years would have passed, and the family she left behind would be almost unrecognizable to her. While Emily built a new life for herself in a city where nobody knew her name or her history, the people she left behind were forced to build a new normal out of the wreckage of that summer. At first, Margaret called every week, leaving voicemails that grew shorter and more careful with each passing month, unsure how much warmth to offer a daughter who never called back, and unsure how to stop hoping she eventually would. Robert refused to speak Emily's name in the house for the first 2 years, his pride wrapped so tightly around his hurt that even Margaret couldn't unwind it, though she noticed, more than once, that he kept an old photo of Emily's college graduation tucked inside his wallet long after he'd claimed to have moved past needing it. Daniel, only 20 at the time, found himself stepping into a role nobody had prepared him for. He picked up extra shifts at the store to help his father, postponed his own plans for a business degree by 2 full years, and quietly became the reliable child by default rather than by choice. Comforting his mother on nights, she thought no one could hear her crying through the thin apartment walls after they were eventually forced to downsize. He married his college girlfriend, Rachel, at 26. In a small ceremony where Emily's absence was felt by everyone in the room, but mentioned by no one, a silence at the edges of an otherwise happy day that Daniel later admitted still stung more than he ever told his own wife. Emily's early years away were, by most outward measures, a success story. She threw herself into her new job with the kind of intensity that impressed her employers and left little room for anything else. Working weekends, taking every project no one else wanted, building a reputation as someone entirely dependable and entirely alone. She built a small circle of friends who knew nothing about Ohio, about a hardware store, about a family she rarely mentioned, and when the subject came up at all, she learned to deflect it with a practiced vagueness that discouraged further questions. She started a relationship with a man named Chris a few years in, a quiet, steady architect who made her laugh in a way she hadn't in a long time. And for a while it seemed like she might actually build the independent life she had walked out the door chasing. But independence, she would later realize, is not the same thing as peace. Late at night, in the quiet moments of busy life can't always fill, she found herself thinking about her mother's voicemails, most of which she had never deleted despite never returning them, about her father's silence, about a brother she had once been close to and now barely knew beyond the occasional impersonal text on a birthday. She kept a folder of old family photos on her laptop that she never opened but also never deleted, a small, stubborn thread connecting her to a place she'd told everyone, including herself, that she no longer needed. Back home, the store never fully recovered. It limped along for another 3 years after Emily left, propped up by Robert's stubbornness and Daniel's unpaid overtime, before finally closing its doors for good the year Emily turned 29, an ending that came quietly, without ceremony, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon that Robert never spoke about to anyone outside the family. The second mortgage became a burden that followed Robert and Margaret into their 60s, eventually forcing them to sell the family house on Maple Street and move into a smaller rental across town, a fact Emily would not learn until much later, long after it had already reshaped every holiday and every family gathering she wasn't present for. Daniel, meanwhile, quietly absorbed the role of the child who stayed, the one who showed up to every hospital visit and every holiday, all while carrying a private resentment toward the sister who hadn't. He rarely spoke about Emily to his own 2 children as they grew, and when he did, it was in careful, guarded language, the kind used to describe someone who exists more as a memory than a person, and his kids knew mostly through a handful of old photographs and a name that made the room go quiet whenever it came up at family dinners. For years, Emily told herself the silence was mutual, that her parents were just as unwilling to reach out as she was, that the blame, if there was any left to assign after all this time, could be spread evenly enough to make her own share of it feel smaller. It was easier to believe that than to admit the truth, that pride had simply calcified into habit, and habit into identity. She became, without ever meaning to, the daughter who left, a story other people in her old life told about her rather than a chapter she was still actively writing herself. There were moments, more than she ever admitted to anyone, where she drafted a message to her mother late at night and deleted it before sending, convinced that too much time had passed for any explanation to matter anymore, that the longer she waited the more foolish and small any apology would sound. Then, in the 9th year, everything Emily had built quietly began to unravel, one piece at a time, in the kind of slow sequence that only looks inevitable when you're looking backward at it. Chris left the relationship first, after learning Emily had never once introduced him to her family in 5 years together, telling her, not unkindly, that he wasn't sure he could build a future with someone who seemed incapable of facing her own past, that he'd started to wonder what it meant about their future if she couldn't even say her mother's name out loud without changing the subject. Emily told herself it was a small loss at first, something she'd recover from quickly the way she'd recovered from every setback since leaving Ohio. She did not expect what came next. Not long after the breakup, the marketing firm she had given nearly a decade of her life to went through a sweeping round of layoffs following a merger, and despite her seniority, despite the long hours and the loyalty she'd shown the company for years, her position was one of the ones eliminated in a single 10-minute meeting that ended a decade of work with a folder of severance paperwork and a box for her desk items. She told herself it was temporary, that someone with her experience and her track record would land on her feet within a few months at most. But months became a year. Savings meant to last through a short transition were stretched to cover rent and bills with nothing steady coming in, Interviews that seemed promising went quiet, and one by one the friends she'd built her city life around grew harder to reach, some drifting away naturally, others simply unable to keep offering support for a situation that didn't seem to be improving. By the 18th month of unemployment, Emily had sold most of what she could sell, moved into a smaller apartment she could barely afford even at its reduced size, and stopped telling people the full truth about how bad things had actually gotten. The confident, independent woman who had walked away from Ohio 9 years earlier found herself, for the first time in her entire adult life, completely out of options, staring at a stack of unopened bills on a kitchen counter in an apartment that no longer felt like the life she'd worked so hard to build. By the time Emily made the decision to go home, she had exhausted almost everything else first. She had asked friends for loans she was too embarrassed to ask for twice. She had applied to more jobs than she could count, hearing nothing back from most, hearing a polite no from the rest. She sat in her nearly empty apartment one Monday night, rent overdue for the second month in a row, and realized there was exactly one number left in her phone that might still answer if she called, a number she hadn't dialed in 11 years but had never once deleted. It took her until 3 in the morning to work up the courage to actually press call, and when her mother picked up, half asleep, saying only a quiet and cautious hello, Emily found she couldn't speak at first. 11 years of silence does not undo itself in a single sentence, and for nearly a full minute, neither woman said anything at all, both simply listening to the other breathe on opposite ends of a phone line that had been silent for over a decade. The following Tuesday, Emily boarded a bus back to Ohio with a single suitcase and a knot in her stomach that never once loosened during the entire ride. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 different ways over those 2 days, apologies that sounded too small, explanations that sounded too rehearsed, and none of them felt like enough for 11 years of silence. When the bus pulled into the small station she once thought she'd escaped forever, rain had just begun to fall, and she stood there for a long moment before calling a cab to the address her mother had given her over the phone, an address that wasn't the house she grew up in, a detail she hadn't let herself think too hard about during the entire ride home. She stood on the porch of a house she had never lived in, suitcase in hand, rain soaking through her jacket, and for a moment she almost turned around and walked back into the dark, back toward the bus station, back toward a life that at least didn't require facing 11 years of everything she'd left unspoken. But the door opened before she could decide, and there was her mother, older than Emily remembered, gray threading through hair that used to be entirely brown, standing in the doorway with an expression Emily couldn't immediately read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't quite forgiveness either. It was something closer to exhaustion, the look of someone who had spent 11 years preparing for a moment she wasn't sure would ever actually come. What Emily didn't know yet, standing in that doorway, was that her father had suffered a heart attack 14 months earlier, a serious one that had kept him in the hospital for 9 days. One Emily had never been told about because nobody had known how to reach her, and no one had been willing to try very hard by that point. The family having long since stopped expecting Emily to respond, even if they did manage to get word to her. She didn't know that Daniel, the brother she assumed would welcome her return the easiest, had spent over a decade quietly furious at a sister who got to leave while he stayed, an anger that had only calcified further during those 9 days in the hospital when he sat alone in a waiting room wondering whether he should even bother trying to track his sister down. She didn't know that the store, the very thing the fight had been about 11 years earlier, had closed its doors for good 6 years ago, the argument that ended her relationship with her family ultimately changing nothing about the outcome it had been fought over in the first place. Margaret stepped aside to let her daughter in, and the house was smaller than anything Emily remembered from childhood, filled with a mixture of old familiar furniture rescued from Maple Street and unfamiliar new walls that had never known Emily as a child. Robert was sitting in a chair by the window, thinner than Emily remembered, moving more carefully than he used to when he stood to see who had come in. When he looked up and saw his daughter standing there soaked from the rain, neither of them said anything for a long moment. 11 years compressed into a single silence neither one knew how to break first. It was Robert, finally, who spoke, his voice quieter and more fragile than Emily remembered it, simply saying her name, the first time she had heard him say it directed at her in over a decade. The conversation that followed lasted long into the night, and it was not the clean, cinematic reconciliation Emily had imagined on the bus ride over. There were tears, but there was also anger that had been saved up for 11 years and needed somewhere to go before anything resembling peace could follow it. Robert told her, in halting sentences that clearly cost him something to get out, about the heart attack, about lying in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning wondering if his daughter would even find out if he died, wondering whether she would come to the funeral or simply hear about it secondhand years later from someone else. Margaret admitted, quietly, sitting beside him with her hand on his knee, that she had kept every voicemail Emily left in those first 2 years, replaying them on nights she missed her most, unable to bring herself to delete a single one even after she'd stopped expecting Emily to ever call again. Emily, for her part, tried to explain what those 11 years had actually looked like from the inside, the pride that kept building on itself every year that passed without a call, the way each additional year of silence made the next apology feel exponentially harder to attempt, until eventually the silence itself became easier to live inside than the vulnerability of breaking it. She admitted, for the first time out loud to anyone, that leaving hadn't felt like a triumph the way she'd once described it to friends, that most nights over the past decade she had simply been too proud and too afraid to be the one to reach out first, waiting for a sign from her parents that never came because they, too, had been waiting for the exact same thing from her. When Daniel arrived the next morning, having been called by Margaret the moment Emily walked through the door the night before, his reaction was not the relief Emily had quietly hoped for during the long, sleepless hours before dawn. He stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, and told his sister plainly, without raising his voice, but without softening it either, that forgiveness wasn't something that could be handed out just because she'd finally run out of other options, that he'd spent 11 years being the one who stayed, the one who picked up every piece she left behind without ever once being thanked for it, and that her sudden reappearance now that her own life had fallen apart didn't automatically erase any of that. He told her about the 9 days in the hospital waiting room, about missing his own daughter's first steps because he was covering a shift at the store their father could no longer manage alone, about the quiet weight of being the good one, the reliable one, the one who never got to leave. That conversation with Daniel broke something in Emily more than anything else that entire week. She realized, sitting in that unfamiliar kitchen with her brother's words hanging in the air between them, that she hadn't come home because she was ready to face what she'd done. She had come home because she had nowhere else left to go. And there was a difference between the two that her own brother had just forced her to confront in a way 11 years of guilt alone never had. The easy version of this story would end there, with a group hug and a promise that everything was fixed by morning. The real version was slower and far less comfortable than that. Robert and Margaret were willing to let her back in, cautiously, one conversation at a time, grateful in a quiet, complicated way to simply have their daughter under the same roof again regardless of what had brought her there. But even their forgiveness came with an unspoken understanding that trust, once broken this thoroughly, doesn't rebuild itself on the timeline the person who broke it might prefer. Daniel needed far longer than his parents did, and even 6 months later, their relationship remained careful, more polite than warm, defined by short conversations at family dinners rather than the closeness they'd once shared as children, a work in progress with no guaranteed happy ending written into it. Emily stayed in Ohio. She took a job at a diner 2 towns over while she rebuilt her finances from almost nothing, working double shifts some weeks, slowly saving enough to eventually afford a small apartment of her own rather than continuing to rely on her parents' spare room. She learned, in the months that followed, that her father's heart attack had left him with permanent limitations he never mentioned directly in their early conversations. Information she only pieced together by watching him wince climbing the porch stairs or grow winded halfway through a short walk to the mailbox. She learned that her mother had quietly kept a box of birthday cards for her in the back of a closet, one written every single year even though she had no address to send them to. Unopened letters addressed to a daughter she refused to fully give up on even during the years everyone around her, including Robert, told her she should. Slowly, over the following year, small things began to shift. Daniel invited her to his daughter's birthday party, a hesitant gesture that Emily understood, without being told, was not a full forgiveness but a door left slightly open. She started helping Robert with small tasks around the house, the kind of quiet, practical care that said more than any apology could. Margaret and Emily began meeting for coffee on Sunday mornings, tentative at first, gradually becoming something closer to the relationship they might have had all along if 11 years hadn't happened in between. Emily got her family back, in pieces, slowly, imperfectly, one careful conversation at a time. But she never got those 11 years back, the hospital stays she wasn't there for, the birthdays marked only by unopened cards in a closet, her niece's first steps she'd only ever hear about secondhand, and there is no version of this story where that particular debt gets fully repaid, no matter how much healing eventually follows. If you were in Robert and Margaret's position, would you have let Emily back in that easily? Would you have needed more time, the way Daniel did? Or would 11 years of silence have been something you simply couldn't move past at all, no matter how sorry the person standing on your porch turned out to be? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happened in our next story, one about a mother who waited 20 years for a single phone call that finally came on the worst possible day. Subscribe for more real-life stories about family, betrayal, and the second chances we don't always deserve, but sometimes get anyway. New stories every week.